Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Now, I will have a very difficult task to keep the passion we have just had in this room. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to also welcome you on behalf of the London School of Economics and LSE Cities, and we are really honored and proud to be part of this very important conference. And we do hope that we can make a valuable contribution. Personally, I'm delighted to start the international comparative perspectives here with a presentation on urbanization and urban change, where I'm also trying, as the subtitle suggests, I'm trying to position Santiago de Chile, and I cannot think of better judges whether I'm doing this appropriately or not than the people in this room. I'm going to structure my presentation into 3 parts. It should not yet move. The first, we'll look at a characterization of global urban change and urbanization. The second part will emphasize the importance of spatial, physical urban development. And in my final slides, I will allude to 2 main strategic problems. They have all been mentioned already, but I'll provide the international perspective and maybe a bit of a way forward, which we can discuss later on. This is a map of the global population distribution. The stronger the yellow, the higher the population density, and you can immediately recognize the enormous concentration of populations, in particular in Asia, in India and China, and by contrast, a far more nodal distribution in Europe, North and South America. Now, behind this image is a hidden, far more important layer of concentration. It's the concentration of human activities in urban areas. On only 0.5% of the land surface of the globe, more than 50% of the world's population are living, producing more than 80% to global economic output. Now, urbanization is, of course, the physical manifestation of socio-economic transformation and change, mainly a shift from agricultural to industrial and increasingly service sector-orientated economies. And it didn't happen throughout the world at the same time. As you can see here, the urban population share over time in selected world regions from 1950 to 2050. Europe and, in fact, Latin America by now are mature urban regions. Chile, in fact, is amongst the most urbanized countries in the world. That's very different in Asia and Africa, countries that are currently going through their urban age, with just about 50% being urban. This is an important reminder to start with, which emphasizes that if we're talking about mature urban contexts, the agenda is no longer about managing the migration from rural to urban settings, but dealing with the existing cities that have been created and shifting from quantity to quality of these environments. A first very important approach of unpacking this vast category of urban, the reference was made before, 87 to 89% urban in Chile. Unpacking that dimension is crucial. We cannot sort of operate with an enormous amount of populations being slotted into this category. We need to understand what's behind this layer. And the first and most obvious approach is to look at the distribution of the population across settlement size. Surprisingly, this reveals that the urban population in most urban regions actually live in cities of less than 500,000 inhabitants. The mega city, here in red, is actually a rather unique or special configuration, which has maybe 10 to 15% of the population. And still, focusing on the very big cities, on the large cities, is crucial, not because of the population, but because of the economy. What I'm showing you here is the cumulative contribution to global GDP of cities above 0.5 million. So these are all the large cities in the world, ranked by the size of their economy from the left to the right. In total, they contribute to 55% of global GDP. The second observation here is that this whole relationship is very much skewed to the left. Few very large urban economies disproportionately contribute to GDP. Let's look at Santiago. According to our statistics, it's the urban economy number 69 in the world. If we're looking at cities the size of Santiago and bigger, we're talking about 30% of global economic output. Now, what's behind this enormous force of these few big cities? Well, very importantly, there is the global economy, and embedded being in the global economy is a major factor in this. But then there's also a very particular industrial composition, and Santiago is a good example of that industrial composition. It's one which emphasizes, and in the future will also further grow, finance and business services, consumer services, and industry actually becomes something that is third or fourth in its importance. What does this mean for the spatial feature of the city? Well, we are talking here about economies that rely increasingly on sociability, the coming together of people, the concentration of people, at least for working. And London, and here the density of working in London very much represents that phenomenon. 140,000 persons per square kilometer concentrate in the London peak. This is a product of that particular industrial composition. Now, what we need to talk about much more in the future is the relationship between the need for that kind of sociability to be created and then how residents are distributed in a much wider metropolitan region. The relationship between these two images is, of course, the daily movement pattern we are creating in the city. But we need to go beyond that very functional approach and understand there are enormous synergies between living and working, and these are the synergies which will foster the future urban economy. Let's stick to residential density for a moment, because it's such a wonderful comparator and gives us a first clue on how we position a city. For example, like Santiago here, measured against 5 other cities, and understanding that, in some ways, Santiago comfortably sits within the two extremes of the Asian cities. By the way, the peak we calculated here is about 50,000 persons per square kilometer. And it's situated between the Asian megacities, Mumbai here, an extreme example of 120,000 persons per square kilometer, and then the far more low-density London, where of course the agenda, and it's not a surprise, is now one of re-densification as part of bringing the quality into the city. When we talk about density, it's important to not immediately assume this is about vertical built form, high-rise buildings. I'm going to show you 3 images of exactly the same density. This is the Upper West Side in New York. It's the highest population density in the city with about 50,000 persons per square kilometer. That's your peak. The same density we have in this slum of Mumbai, mainly achieved through an enormous surface coverage of buildings and a severe compromise in personal living space of less than 3 square meters per person. And of course, very little space for access and any other urban amenities. And yet again, there's another model. The European city model, in many parts, here the example of the Cerda grid of Barcelona, once again replicates similar levels of density and adds 2 very important components, functional and social mix. These are partially a result of architectural features these kind of physical environments provide the city with. Let me briefly talk about the 2 main trends we're currently seeing as part of an urban age around the world. The one is, of course, one of verticalization, and this city is no exception. The extreme example is Shanghai, where over a period of from 1980 to 2005, the number of high-rise buildings grew by more than around 10,000 buildings. Today, the city has more high-rise buildings than the entire west coast of the United States. The opposite trend is vertical expansion, Mexico City being a good example, where over the same period we had an increase in urban territory of 30%. Now, unfortunately, this is the far more dominant feature of contemporary urbanization, where current estimates assume that from 2000 to 2030 we'll have a 3-fold increase in urban land. So all the urbanized land around the world up to 2000 will be tripled over a short period of 30 years. Getting this right, or ideally reducing that increase, might be amongst the most important challenges of the early 21st century. Why? Because we already have a lot of evidence that excessive urban sprawl is hugely problematic. Our work with the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate has confirmed that, for example, the United States spends about $400 billion per year on the consequences of excessive urban sprawl. These are external costs related to transport, sewage infrastructure. They're related to health, to accessing services. They are related to utilities. And on top, it's that excessive urban sprawl, which of course disproportionately further increases the already high amount of global energy consumption, which is related to urban areas, and thereby also the enormous degree of CO2 emissions emitted from urban regions. Let me now come to the two sort of strategic challenges, which I guess fairly obvious to share, but just to re-emphasize, they have already been addressed. The first is about the social dimension. What you're seeing here are the 5 largest cities in South America, and we are mapping the distribution of the least educated. And it's a very consistent pattern that these cities share, whereby the poor are peripheralized, they are moved to, or they move from the beginning or are moved to the periphery of the city, being deprived of the many, many services which the more central areas in the city have. Now, social segregation in Santiago is no exception. We have seen these charts before. The images look fairly similar. In our own research, we have shown again and again how much this then is a form of very regressive urban development, which exacerbates rather than mitigates the enormous income and wealth inequalities. The lack of access to services, jobs, are good examples. Ricky, in fact, will talk about how we've dealt with that in London. The second strategic challenge is about linking, and it's very much the coordination question we have heard about before, linking the physical growth of the city with its infrastructure, and very importantly, the public transport infrastructure. What you see here is a comparison between Atlanta and Berlin, 2 cities at a similar size in the metro region at similar wealth levels. But as a result of the spatial form and infrastructures they have locked in, this is development which is determined for the next probably decades, if not centuries to come. In Atlanta, there are only 10%, less than 10% of people moving by public transport, cycling or walking. That share in Berlin is almost 70%. And don't underestimate what that means for the quality and sociability of the city. So again, let's go to Santiago, using that very important indicator of the modal share, the way people travel in the city. It's 73% for public and non-motorized travel. Similar to that of Sao Paulo, and in fact, once again, situated quite comfortably across sort of other experiences in the cities outlined here. However, there are 2 main problems with your modal share. The first one is that the 73% is not a choice. This comes as a result of income levels. Whoever can afford to drive in the city overall tends to drive. That's very different in London. It's very different in Hong Kong. The second problem is one of trend. Between 2000 and 2010, the ridership in public transport declined by 18%, while car use went up by 80%, if our intelligence on that is correct. That, of course, has enormous consequences. Once again, of course for the social dimension of the city, of course for the environment, but more importantly, enormous consequences for the economy. Why? Because I emphasized how important the quality of the built environment and the sociability dimension of cities is becoming. Traveling on the left in that means of transport with this excessive space consumption is simply no longer a valuable proposition. And I'm sure Enrique will pick up on that point and talk about the efficiency of instead moving people in very different ways in cities. The costs of the choice of moving in cities are probably the most important one to consider. We heard about congestion, which is up to 15% of GDP in places like Beijing, and local air pollution, which is a vote winner in many cities. It was featured highest on your areas of concern. The good news is we have increasing evidence that compact, connected, and coordinated urban growth built around mass public transport can create cities that are economically dynamic, healthier, and have lower carbon emissions. So this brings us to the governance question and the metropolitan dilemma, which I'm sure you'll be also too much aware of, whereby very few cities, in fact, as they have grown, are able to really oversee and govern their metropolitan regions, their functional urban regions, to provide for a sensible approach of coordinating land use, transport, and of course the big social agendas. However, there are also very good signs. We recently conducted a survey of about 50 city governments across the world in very different areas. And this is a question about who is leading key policy sectors. And already today, The key sectors of spatial planning, utilities, urban transport are very urbanized policy sectors. They are led by metropolitan city or sub-city governments. That's an expertise which we need to explore far more in the future. And of course, I think Santiago has an important agenda to address. Let me conclude. I think that the idea of the re-evolution of Chilean cities as well as Santiago is a very timely agenda. It's a shift from quantity to quality. We'll have to learn and deal with a lot of the good ideas that are out there. But that's probably not going to be the problem. The ideas are there. We need to address the institutional question, and it's not only in your country and city. This is more or less the issue for most places we are operating in. It's an issue where we need to facilitate or create institutions that can deliver, on the one hand, good civic leadership, and at the same time integrate a much broader collaborative decision-making process. Thank you very much.